Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, how mad was King George the Third? Why is this so? 1 second. Sorry. The original link to the video, top of the description. Below that, link to the Discord. Would love to have you. Makes it easier for me to interact with you and see your recommendations. Let's go. 7 minutes in history, preemptive like, how mad was King George the Third?
George III was King of Great Britain and Ireland during some of the country's most pivotal moments in history. George's life and reign oversaw the winning of the empire through the 7 Years' War, the abolition of slavery, and Britain becoming the dominant power in North America and India. But he also saw the empire lose its American colonies during the American War of Independence and engaged in several battles against Napoleonic France. However, all anyone seems to remember about him is that he was known as the Mad King. King George is arguably one of the most interesting monarchs of the Hanover period in British history, but did you know that he was actually the longest reigning
Here he is.
British king in the country's history, coming in third of overall
Just
monarchs
Victoria
behind Queen
and
Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria respectively. Or that it was King George himself who originally purchased Buckingham Palace, primarily as a residence for his wife, Queen Charlotte, or that the remedies taken for his illnesses were disturbing, with various methods being employed such as placing leeches on his eyeballs to help.
I didn't know that he was the one to purchase Buckingham Palace or build Buckingham Palace. Was Buckingham Palace already there before
cure his
that?
dementia, as well as many other gruesome and twisted methods. Well, stick around because this short 7-minute documentary will cover all and more. And if you like this video, please subscribe and let me know in the comments if there are any other topics you would like to see me cover. Before we actually look into the King's madness, we should answer the question of who actually was King George III and why is he important. George III was born in 1738 to Frederick, Prince of Wales and Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha in Norfolk House in London. He was the grandson to King George II and the first son of the heir apparent Frederick, and was born 2 months premature, with doubts being drawn as to whether he would survive. Despite this, he was publicly baptised a month later and went on to grow into a healthy, if not a bit of a shy child. He hailed from the House of Hanover, who took over the throne after the death of Queen Anne from the House of Stuart, and George was in fact the first of his house to actually be born on the British Isles, and spoke English as his first language, and even more so to contrast with his predecessors, he never actually visited Hanover. George was 12 when his father died, leaving him as the heir to the throne. Before that, his grandfather, King George II, never really paid much attention to his eldest son or his grandchildren, but once Frederick passed and George became heir, he became closer to his heir apparent, granting him the title of Prince of Wales. During this period, he was the subject of many marriage proposals, with his future Prime Minister, Lord Bute, advising against George marrying Lady Sarah Lennox, from whom he was smitten with. George's sense of duty, knowing he would someday be king, meant that he would not marry for love, he would marry for the nation. The king proposed a marriage to the Princess of Prussia,
about the new window, guys. Just gotta go back 10 seconds.
With George's sense of duty, knowing he would someday be king, meant that he would not marry for love, he would marry for the nation. The king proposed a marriage to the Princess of Prussia, Sophie Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, which George resisted, along with the advice of his mother. The next year, when he was aged 22, George succeeded the British throne when his grandfather, King George II, died suddenly. With George III ascending to the throne, the search for a suitable wife intensified, and George settled on a minor German princess, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The couple
giant mouth.
First met each other on their wedding.
Or is that just me? Sorry.
German princess, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The couple first met each other on their wedding day in St. James's Palace. A fortnight after the marriage, the pair were crowned in a coronation at Westminster Abbey. The new King George never took a mistress, in contrast to the former king, who was heavily criticised for taking mistresses, and also enjoyed a happy marriage with the Queen. The pair had 15 children in total, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and lived in many different places. George I.
Well, my mom is one of 11, or no, 9. Yeah, one of 9. 11 people in her family, but, you know, I know it was more popular for royals, right? Or just people in general back then to have more kids.
6 sons and 6 daughters and lived in many different places. George III even purchased Buckingham House as a family retreat, which is now the site occupied by Buckingham Palace, the current headquarters of the British monarchy. The early reign of King George III was chaotic, to say the least. Some of the political instability he experienced came from Britain's involvement in the 7 Years' War, which begun before George became king. Britain was a constitutional monarchy at the time, ruled by a ministerial government. George fell into many disagreements with Parliament, which led to ruled by a ministerial government. George fell into many disagreements with Parliament, which led to him being accused of being an autocrat. Despite this, George reorganised the relationship between Crown and Parliament. When he ascended, the Crown produced relatively little income. George surrendered the Crown estate to Parliament willingly in order for a return of income to be paid by the country in support of his household. The agreement still stands in place today. The main crisis that plagued his reign...
Sorry, what?
Parliament. When he ascended, the Crown produced relatively little income. George surrendered the Crown estate to Parliament willingly in order for a return of income to be paid by the country in support of his household.
Okay.
Agreement in order for a relatively little income. George surrendered the Crown estate to Parliament willingly.
So he surrendered this place to Parliament?
In order for a return of income to be paid by the country.
In exchange of continued salary paid through taxes, essentially?
In support of his household. The agreement still stands in place today. Right? The main crisis that plagued his reign, however, was, of course, the American War of Independence. The 13 colonies proved difficult to rule, which came to a head over the lack of American representation in Parliament, which was seen...
I live in one of those colonies, by the way, Rhode Island. One of the 13.
Difficult to rule, which came to a head over the lack of American representation in Parliament, which was seen as a denial of rights and popularised the phrase, no taxation without representation. The king saw the colonies as little more than an inconvenience, and didn't hold too much interest in them before they began to pivot away from the British Empire. George was one of the last to admit that America was lost. As the war waned on and became increasingly costly, it took several riots and protests throughout Britain before the king privately admitted that America was lost. When the office of the American Minister to London was created in 1785, George welcomed the ambassador from his previous colony, placing himself as the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. Again, a display of his dutiful nature as king. Despite the chaotic start to his reign, despite the American colonies...
Were we sort of taught to vilify this guy more than he deserved? I see as him, or I've always seen him as evil Satan reincarnate. No, I don't know.
Despite the chaotic start to his reign, despite the American colonies being lost under his watch, and despite the political turmoil he sat through, King George III actually became an extremely popular monarch to his subjects, with his piety and faithfulness to his wife making him an extremely admirable figure. However, it was at that point that the king's mental health and physical health began to deteriorate. There are several theories put forward trying to explain why the king suffered with his mental health, but no one is quite certain. A genetic disease called porphyria is theorized to cause his mania, and studies of samples of the king's hair was posthumously examined and revealed there were high levels of arsenic, which could have been a possible trigger for the mental illness.
So this is King Charles' great grandfather?
By 1788, the king had become seriously deranged, speaking for hours without pause, repeating himself and foaming at the mouth. At the same time, his vocabulary became more complex and creative, which has been put forward as a symptom of bipolar disorder, which it is believed the king suffered from. His doctors were at a loss to explain his creeping madness, and stories began to spread of the king's illness, such as the claim he shook hands with a tree, believing it was the king of Prussia. The methods for treating the king's illnesses were primitive by our standards, with it involving being restrained several times until calm. The operations of the crown nearly got taken away from him by decree of Parliament before George III seemed to make a recovery. During the period before he fell ill again, George oversaw two defining parts of British history: the abolition of slavery and the Napoleonic Wars, with the former being pushed directly by him. George's illness seemed to come and go during the war in Europe. However, even so, his popularity increased. By 1810, the king was pretty much blind, suffering with cataracts, and suffered physical pain from rheumatism, which was coupled with the death of his youngest and favourite daughter, Princess Amelia. This saw him relapse back into a madness. It's reported he slumped into a deep melancholy. Before he fell into a permanent state of insanity, he signed the Regency Act, allowing his eldest son, George IV, to act as regent on his behalf so the crown could still carry out its duties. At the height of his madness, King George III moved to Windsor Castle and lived in seclusion, only rarely seeing his doctors, whose methods for treatments were barbaric by today's standards. Leeches were placed on the king's eyes to treat his cataracts, and he was repeatedly restrained to stop him from harming himself during his more intense episodes. The king also began to suffer from dementia, becoming increasingly deaf and blind, which caused him to not understand much of what was happening around him, with him not even understanding the death of his wife, Queen Charlotte. During Christmas in 1819, it's reported he spoke nonsense non-stop for 58 hours, and in the last weeks of his life he became unable to walk. Just a month later, on the 29th of January in 1820, the king died after catching
I was laughing at the guy in the video, and obviously someone going... Old age is kind of terrifying, so there's nothing funny about that, obviously.
On the 29th of January in 1820, the king died after catching pneumonia. Despite his popularity during his lifetime and his position as the longest-serving male monarch in British history, the legacy of King George III is mixed. Nothing will separate him from his reputation as the Mad King, but there's no denying he was probably one of the most successful British monarchs in history, overseeing the cementing of the British Empire, the abolition of slavery, and the end of Napoleon's conquest in Europe. At the same time, he was a key part of America's pivot towards independence, and is even referred to as the Tyrant King in popular culture for his role in denying American independence, and is even referred to as the Tyrant
King George,
culture,
of course.
for his role
Sorry, I love The Office.
in denying American representation in Parliament. Despite all this, his legacy is still felt today, but at the same time, we cannot discount the mental illnesses the king suffered from. What is clear is that the king still had a very clear sense of duty to the crown and country, and only suffered from his madness sporadically, usually operating as a relatively competent ruler, and rarely let his personal illnesses interfere with the running of the country. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel, where I'll be making more content like this. I
Definitely.
really appreciate you watching, and look forward to seeing you again next time.
It's a really cool video. Yeah, my first video of the day here. I hope you guys are all doing well. First recorded, I've already put up 2. The Harry Enfield football one, which is so funny. And why English is popular. But I'm going to put up this one as well. Hope you guys are doing well. Would really appreciate any answers to any of the questions I might have. Or just any comments in general. See you guys next time. Bye.